welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. This is Jessica. I am your host, and I am here with the author, C.J. Cooke, who wrote a lot of really wonderful books, including The Lighthouse Witches. And I mean, I'll let you go on and talk about, give us your list of books. But today we're talking about the Book of Witching, which was really a very interesting read. And I have to say, I learned a lot reading it as well. So welcome, C.J. Cooke. Tell us about the Book of Witching.
So thank you for having me. It's lovely to chat. I'm C.J. Cooke, and the Book of Witching comes out next week. It is a dual timeline Gothic fiction work with two timelines set in 1594 and the present day, 2024. So the 1594 narrative both take place in Orkney, actually, and Glasgow. But the Orkney narrative in 1594, it retells a real-life witch trial, the first of 72 witch trials that took place in Orkney over that period. And this witch trial, it features a woman called Alison Balfour, and it's quite an unusual trial. So I wanted to re-explore it, and the contemporary narrative is connected. So we have a woman who she's based in Glasgow. She's called up about her teenage daughter who has gone to explore the Orkney Islands, but there has been an accident of some kind, a terrible fire that has left her seriously injured, seriously burned, in hospital, unconscious, on life support. Her boyfriend is dead, and her best friend, is missing. So there's a mystery around what caused this fire and why did they go to Orkney in the first place? And the answers lie in the Book of Witching.
So the story itself, so Alison Balfour's trial, and this is kind of something I was reading about because I was unaware of it. So what drew you to that one specifically to be the first part of the story? I think one of the things that's really interesting just in general about that time period is the politics of the area and the real ramping up of witch trials as they knew it, that area. So chat a little about that.
Sure. So what drew me to Alison Balfour, or to tell her story? So when I was researching the Lighthouse Witches back in 2019, it was kind of before we had all these books about witches. But nonetheless, I was really fascinated and sort of horrified to learn that Scottish witch trials were a thing, that this happened, that, there were so many miscarriages of justice, and that they also happen quite close to where I live. So that really, when it's literally close to home, it makes it more real and involving human beings, as opposed to just being sort of a chapter in a history book. And when I came across Alison's story, it really moved me because it's a very unique witch trial. I know that witch trials themselves are quite unique things. They're quite intriguing and horrifying. But in her case, her family were tortured as well. Usually torture was used on the witches, who were usually women, to force confessions of all kinds. But in her case, she was tortured, but also her family was tortured. So it was just really quite a striking story. And when I began researching this, because I'm writing about a real person and I want to do justice to her, I don't want to, I don't know, I think there's an ethical responsibility you have as a writer to do your duty right, to research, the time period. And I really did a lot of research around the socio-political situation at the time. And I'm really glad I did, because I think I was able to really pull together quite a bit about this trial that I couldn't find from a primary source. There is no trial record other than her retraction. But the fact that she had her retraction taken down, it's a very unusual thing. If you want to convict a witch, and particularly in this case, no spoilers, but she was being blamed for something that someone else had done. And so they really wanted to just get rid of her. They wanted to put this issue to bed and show that they had sort of caught the villain. But someone thought it would be a good idea, right as she's being put to the stake, to take down her retraction. And I spoke with a witch historian, Professor Julian Goodare, who's actually based in Edinburgh. And he said, yeah, I think the fact that they took it down indicates that they had lost control of the trial. And that really sparked my imagination and pushed me to dig deeper into all the different kind of scenarios. And I did find that Orkney at that point was this weird kind of, no, it's not what's beautiful, but geographically, politically, there was a real kind of power issue because the King of Scotland, it historically, Orkney had just become Scottish, but previously it was part of the northern countries, Norwegian territories, and they spoke Norn up until, I guess, the 18th century, as well as English. So yeah, there you have this weird kind of situation where it's so far north that the earls just did what they wanted, and there was a huge amount of corruption. So, and the people were being mistreated and starved, and land was being seized left, right, and centre. And it was a very dark moment for the Orcadians. So, yeah, I think I've answered your question.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. And I do have to say, when I visited Scotland, I visited twice, and I know
Yeah,
Edinburgh also had some very well-known
yeah.
witch trials. And I think there's just a lot of I suppose, like obviously here in the States, everybody thinks about Salem, and there's a lot of lesser known ones throughout New England, especially because that seems to be where that
Yeah.
that particular brand of puritanical thought really seems to land. But I do think, there's a lot of just crazy, crazy history there. And it was really interesting because the story, it opens with Allison, and she's, watching family be inducted into this I suppose, like, this group, the Triskelion, and you find out that she once was a member and she's not a member anymore. And there's just this really sort of loose interpretation as to what is witchcraft and what is more like your, like, like you practice folk magic and you help people, and then versus, the church and the king and what they consider witchcraft. And
Mhm.
it's really, really complex. And then on the other side, you have the story of Clem, who, her teenage daughter has a daughter herself. And you find out that, obviously Erin, her daughter, was in this horrible situation, and it's somehow connected to Allison and the Book of Witching itself, which is almost like its own character in the story too. So when you set out to tell the story, did the two timelines always exist for you? Like, was there ever a point where you're just like, like Erin and Clem's story felt like it was taking hold, or Allison's story felt like it was taking hold?
Um, no, not really. I really set out from the get-go to have the two timelines. So I wanted them to speak to each other. I think I'm really fascinated by the way the history is in the present, or the past is in dialogue with us, that there isn't as much of a distance as we maybe think. And so I'm really interested in finding ways to make those two speak in dialogue. Um, and I think at certain moments during the writing process, I had to focus more on one rather than the other, because in Clam's story, there's a lot of research that I had to do around the treatment of burns victims. Um, I had to speak to several people who are experts in that, and to do my own kind of scoping. And then I had to speak to an ex-detective to work out how the detectives would work. So yeah, both stories took a bit of different approaches and different research, but yeah, they came together okay.
So talk about the Book of Witching itself and the Triskelion. How did all of that part of the story begin to fit together?
So the Book of Witching actually came out of a something I found when I was in Orkney doing research, and I went to the archives because I'd heard that they had really well kept records of the witch trials. And while I didn't find, because they do have trial records from, there were 72 witch trials in such a small community. It was a huge thing, and so many families affected and communities destroyed. But with Alison's trial, there wasn't that many. As I said, the only thing that we have to know that she existed at all was in the form of this retraction. But what I did find was the folklore files came out from the archive, and I found a few mentions of the Book of the Dark Arts. And one of the records went into detail of what it was. It was an ancient book from the beginning of time. It had black pages with no writing visible on them, but it contained evil deeds. And whoever owned the book went straight into Satan's keep the minute they passed on. So it was this book that couldn't be destroyed either. So that really, I felt I had to do something with that needed to go in my story. I love folklore. I think it tells us a lot about the stories that, communities have told themselves and nations have told themselves. So that had to go in.
There's a lot of familial drama on both sides of the story. There's, Erin, her father's estranged from her and her mother. And then there's Allison and her family, who's estranged from her, sort of a lot of it revolving around her just leaving the Triskelion. And that it really drove the story emotionally. I suppose I can guess, but what about this particular book made you want to tell a family story as well?
Well, I do tend to write about family dynamics in my books, and I'm really interested in dysfunctional families in particular. I think we all think we probably have some kind of dysfunction in our families, but um, with Erin's story, I was thinking about her psychology and the reasons why she goes to Orkney as they unfold in the book. And I thought about her as a young woman and the things that are driving her. And so I think when her dad came onto the page and he was kind of a jerk from the outset, and I thought, oh, okay, right, I think that there's friction here. And yeah, and he was down in England. So he developed quite quickly after he for me he as soon as he arrived in the hospital, I began to see that this family dynamic was quite fractured, and that was, a big part for Aaron's being in the hospital in the first place.
And then as far as like Allison's family, that was also very interesting. So you said like her family, so historically her family members were also tortured.
Yes, I don't think I should probably say too much, but
No, 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 no,
um,
no, that's fine. It's just I thought
yeah,
that it was interesting because really just in the beginning a lot of it was, her kind of watching her family from afar, because I don't want to say she was like 100% cast out, but she was, odd out in her family.
mhm,
And yeah.
yeah. Yeah, it's very unusual. I haven't actually read of anything like this in another trial. So that's, and yeah, the fact that she went through that, I think just is one of the reasons why I wanted to write about her. But yeah, I had to think carefully about why they would go to such lengths, to really implicate her and to make sure that, because, who would withstand that? No one would. No one's gonna to come through that without confessing. So it's sort of guaranteed. The abuse of power in these cases is really horrifying. But then we see echoes of that in the present. It's kind of another level of horror to read such things, because you see hundreds of years later and we're still seeing abuses of power, not necessarily in the same way, but there's shades of, there's this familiar feeling when you're reading these historical documents.
I also wanted to just talk again a little bit about just politics during Allison's time. It sounds like, like she was really just used. I mean, all of the women in all of these trials, and men and women, who are or convicted and killed, were used as scapegoats for something. But like, it sounds
Yeah.
like she just fell into a really unfortunate situation with some highborn, I guess, political figures, as you will, in the time. How did your research process go with that specifically, like with the
About
Stuarts? And yeah.
Oh, well, I needed to understand the sort of social structure of the period. So yeah, I looked at historical documents, and I listed them in the book, as I can't think off the top of my head which ones I looked at, but I did have quite a big uh, pile of reading material to think about who was there. But yeah, and I tried to use as many real historical figures as I could and find information on them. But it is from a long time ago, so there's not a ton of material on them, and there's certainly a lot of secondary material that you're relying upon that you're not always sure. I think we've got to remember that of the medieval period, we have maybe 15% of the text that existed then. So we're seeing everything through a keyhole.
Did you have a character that really stood out for you while you were writing in either timeline? Was there somebody who surprised you?
I mean, I think Alison is obviously key. I had to sort of really dig into her psychology, but I wanted to make sure that I got my facts right and understood the sort of life that she would have been living back then, and the position she was in, and why she made the choices she made. I think as a woman who's being held in a prison, she doesn't have a ton of agency. So I had to think about ways that she could exercise agency in a realistic way and make choices as a protagonist that were also realistic and possible. So yeah.
And as far as just how the past and the future, or the past and the present rather, connected, did you see all of the connections while you were building the story, or did they pop up as the two timelines came together? And also, I guess on that note as well, when you were writing the two timelines, do you write them consecutively, or do you write them, I suppose, like you'll write one complete and then the other complete and weave them together?
No, it just comes organically, because the story has to come kind of, in a way that laces those two together. What was the first question again?
My first question was, did it seem to kind of come together organically? Like, did you plan all of the connections, or did you see them as you were writing?
Oh yeah, so I think a lot of them, I mean, I do plan my novels, but it's really difficult to plan all the little cogs that turn the story. So I think, most of them came through when I was writing, and as I made discoveries through my research. So yeah, I don't plan that intensively. I don't think you can, but yeah, they would have come when I was editing, and thinking about how to stitch the stories together, how to increase the tension, and so on.
So, are you working on anything now?
Yes, I've almost finished next year's novel, which is set in the 1480s, and it is set in Innsbruck, and it is also about a witch trial, but there's no dual timeline this time. It's just set in one period in the 15th century in Tyrol.
I'm looking forward to it. I think it's amazing to me just how these stories really capture people hundreds of years later. And maybe it is really because of what you were saying. I mean, I suppose there's different reasons for it. On one hand, people do tend to gravitate towards the darker parts of history because they seem strange. But as you were saying earlier, there are also a lot of similarities. I suppose when you consider what there was back then, perhaps that was their version of trashy reality television, which is a very depressing thought, but it seemed very much like it became that these trials really became like the social talk, like a way to be in the know, as to what was happening. And it's really awful to think about it that way. But I do think there's just a lot of similarities, as you were saying, to things that happen, but also just the way that the public reacts to things.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
All right. Well, thank you so, so much. Once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Public Library's Turn the Page podcast. My guest was
CJ Cooke.
And we are going to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.